the title of the panel discussion, which, as I mentioned, was Archaeological Engagement Online, from data mining to tweeting. I myself have a couple of questions lined up for our panel. I can posit the first one and leave it open for discussion. I certainly have my own 2 cents on a lot of these topics, being someone who this semester has taught 3 classes online, and then obviously the second half of the semester teaching all of them online. And then some of us on the OAC who are educators ourselves probably have our own perspectives on teaching online courses, but then also online engagement. I remember at the fall OAC meeting, this was a topic of brief discussion about our online presence with Instagram, Twitter, the website. But I figured this might be a good time for us as a community to discuss how we should engage people in online education, outreach, and engagement virtually, particularly since the current situation has us all virtually meeting. So the first question I have isn't necessarily about engagement, but I thought it might be a little bit more of a approachable topic since we all deal with this as archaeologists, would be how should archaeological data be stored online, and what should or should not be publicly accessible and protected online? Figure we start with what I think is the softball question.
That's the easy question?
Yeah, I figured we'd ramp up to like, what's the meaning of life after that? I mean, I certainly could start the discussion if we'd like on where my perspective is. Having back in 2017 for current research for OAC, written a short little thing about all the stuff I was able to data mine just from online archives and through, well, before I continue on my little point here, for those of you who are listening in, if you can't see my face on the WebEx meeting, that's because I'm using my webcam to stream on Twitch. So I'm sorry to those of you on WebEx who can't see my face right now, but it is visible to technically the public. But anyway, with data mining, I found there was a lot of, I guess, gray literature that was behind a lot of different platforms that you either had to have a subscription for. I mean, for example, the online mapping system with the, Ohio SHPO. Look at Kentucky SHPO and how their GIS database is accessible. But there's quite a large amount of data, basically 50 plus years old, of archaeological reports that are online through efforts of libraries and museums to digitize old reports. And I mean, there's, plenty of data that can be accessed that is site specific and in fact shows excavation plans for very well-known sites. And I would argue that the concern over looting for publishing data about sites that are being excavated in the last 20 years, I think is less of a concern than the sites that are known for the last 100 years that are still being looted to this day. For example, the South Park site in Cuyahoga Valley National Park has been known about for, I mean, Brian Redmond, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, for at least 100 years. And a lot of the excavation information and data about that site is easily accessible if you know how to Google something. So, I would argue from a public accessibility standpoint, there's very few situations that I would say, locational context, unless the landowner is involved and says they don't want it to be known. The risks that we're posing for, say, publishing a map, like for example in Jared's presentation that shows, well, you just had earthwork sites that were known from mills. There's no harm in publishing pinpoint accuracy Mills's earthwork site, since that the entire atlas is online and visibly accessible. So my stance is more of I'm willing to be more open access to a lot of archaeological data than probably others. So I'd be curious what other people think about making data more publicly accessible. In other words, not having it behind some vetting like the SHPO, or obviously I don't condone or approve of the idea of just letting the GIS just open and out there for anyone to just peruse. But I do think that there could be some compromise or middle ground, making archaeological data a little bit more accessible on online platforms.
So Kevin, are you asking this in light of where we are with this virus, that since we're all doing digital stuff, that now we may be putting data online that is questionable or that we shouldn't? Is that why you're asking?
Um, well, yeah. So actually, Kevin was the one who posed this panel discussion. It was more my idea. I was more thinking because we're all, if we weren't already dealing with online engagement, we certainly are now in the wake of COVID-19. And I just thought it would be topical to discuss future plans that we as archaeologists might have for when we decide to publish our data. How are we going to be sharing it and circulating it beyond the traditional means that we would normally think of, like peer-reviewed publications? How would we make it accessible for, um, you know, not necessarily just, I'm obviously a very young archaeologist myself, but the students I'm teaching are even younger than me, and they, are in some cases learning archaeology in online courses or having to take, and particularly this semester, classes that were originally physical medium based in-person classes, having access to data and artifacts analysis in some way, shape, or form in an online platform that allows more collaboration, perhaps more insights into data that we hadn't previously thought about. For example, when I was talking about that paper I did back in 2017, no shovel required. Brad probably knows about that because I was still an AmeriCorps intern at the time. But most of that was done through data mining. It was just going through um, digitized newspaper archives, going through um, old reports that had been put up on the Ohio History Journal. I think they digitized all of the early Ohio Historical and Archaeological Quarterly publications, which include excavation reports in there, and just combing through that and finding data that hadn't really gone back through in necessarily the same systematic format. That obviously being able to do that on a computer changes the game, I think. Um, but how we decide to do that for new reports, I think, is still the question still up in the air. Obviously, we want to digitize records that are 100-year-old reports. That's probably fine, but what do we do with the report that from excavations this year? Are we going to just send it down to SHPO and then call it a day? Do we want to include it into? Obviously, we have current research of OAC, which has a lot of good excavation reports freely accessible to anyone who wants to do that research, but there isn't really necessarily a standard for that kind of open access.
This is Kevin. Can you hear me, Eric?
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think you've raised a lot of great questions. And one thing I would say right off the bat is that there's a lot of variability when one was working in different states. Like in Ohio, it seems like there's a little bit more openness to putting a map of a site or a depiction online or in a computer internet available format. In states like Indiana and Kentucky, the powers that be in the SHPO's office do not want you to do that. So that's always been a big issue with that sort of public, informing the public or getting these information that might be in a report or in some other format out to the public.
Right. And I think, at least from my limited experience, certainly being, like I said, a young archaeologist, so I don't have the years and sometimes decades as some of you do. I think the big concern that I've seen with making archaeological data more open access and easily accessible to um, the public in general, anyone who has internet access, is that someone will take that information and then do malicious behavior with it. But I think, uh, at least from my perspective, there's already plenty of data that's already open access. That if someone wanted to go loot a site, they're not exactly going to have a hard time finding sites to loot. Um, so I don't see it as necessarily a preventative measure under the current climate. Certainly for people who are not as tech savvy, it's a hurdle to figure out where to find these things. But like I said, the South Park site is not exactly no, but it's not exactly a hard to find site online in terms of excavation reports, what was found there. It's well known in the collector community. Um, it's well known in the archaeological community, at least and I'm specifically referring to my experience being in the Northeast Ohio region, but certainly we all have regions where people know about the most famous sites, and those are the ones that are going to be the most at risk because they've been known about the longest. Preferential attachment to a site that everyone's known about since like the turn of the 20th century. And then oftentimes I feel like in CRM contexts, except for the site that might be still in a farm field and still exposed to future looting activities or collecting, like the presentation you gave today, the wastewater treatment plant. I don't think anyone is going to be going on to that site and necessarily doing anything to that site. I mean,
It's surrounded by barbed wire fence, so you're absolutely correct.
right, and in a lot of CRM contexts, the reason we're out there is oftentimes to, unfortunately, salvage what information is there before some development or some construction project happens. And so a lot of sites that have been documented in the last 20 years are not in contexts that are at risk to the same extent as, say, a site we've known about for 100 years. And so I guess that's really why I raised the question of, should we still maintain these concerns over protecting archaeological sites by protecting them from disseminating information, when that in turn that can affect access amongst archaeologists who are trying to get access to this information, or perhaps they aren't able to look at this information on the same aggregate scale as older collections or older site reports because it's behind some sort of database that either isn't compiled in a way that makes it easy to search like a database, or it's because there's, they're not optically character recognized in the case of older documents that you can do a quick search and find for specific keywords. So I don't, it doesn't necessarily, we don't have to have any conclusions from this question.
I would raise another issue that is a counterpoint to the protecting it by hiding the information. You also, I mean, like Eric said, if people who want to find it are going to find it, and they don't need the internet to do it. They can walk next door or down the road and talk to somebody who is a collector, who knows another collector, who knows another collector. And so that information's out there. Where sites are, the people who don't have access to those hidden reports know more about the archaeological record than a lot of us do. Most of us probably. And so finding archaeological sites, collecting from them, digging into them, and for private collections, whatever, that's going to happen. And what I think is something to consider is that hiding the information that professionals and academics produce actually enables that, because people aren't aware of what's out there. So we make it really hard for people who aren't already engaged in it to engage in archaeology. And so we can further preservation by expanding the engagement that we get from the public by making it easier to get the information. Because if you're not in one of those circles already that has all that information or connections to the people who have all those informations by word of, that information by word of mouth, then there's a hurdle to get into that. And so if we lower our hurdle, then people will care. They'll understand why preservation is important. Will it maybe have some specific instances of damage to a site that wouldn't have happened had we not shared the information? Probably. But will we get broader engagement from the public? And if more people are interested in it and aware of the problem of damage to the non-renewable resource, I think that we have that public policing that, we have 140 OAC members. We're not out there all the time running around checking and making sure that sites aren't being destroyed. We can't do that. And so if we share our information, we make co-conspirators out of the public in terms of preservation.
Kevin, I would agree. We have this argument all the time, particularly in Southwest Ohio, where we have sites like the Turpin site, which is being consistently looted. My thought on this all along has been, let's publicize where the site is. Let's have a bronze plaque here that says, this is the site of the Turpin site, what it is. It's a sacred site to Native Americans. If you see anything happening in this, let people know, because I think most people are very good about preserving things, and it's only a small percentage, and they become your eyes and ears on the ground. I will say, however, that we have run into the opposite argument from our tribal partners. They do not want this stuff being publicized. They have been against us putting up this sort of stuff because they view this as a long history of sites being looted, and they look at the publicizing it as an invitation. I've tried to convince them otherwise, and I've had very little luck in doing that. So it's really difficult situation.
Yeah, it's a delicate line to walk for sure.
Well, it seems to me that, we're kind of conflating several things in terms of like these. You're really talking about different audiences for these things. Sometimes we're talking about technical reports with specific locations of sites. For most of, if you want to reach the public out there beyond just, let's say, collectors or someone that might boot a site, they're not going to read a technical report, and they really don't need to know exactly where that site is. But you can provide a lot of information. You can vet some of these more general reports. Like, we produce and field reports of our work, and I posted all those on Academia EDU, but we don't say exactly where the site is. We don't show a map exactly where the site's located. But pretty much all the other information's out there, and it's pretty digestible by most people that might be interested in reading that. So I think there's different ways to do this, but anytime you're going to do any of this outreach, particularly virtually, you have to think about who do you want to attract. And you're not going to attract everybody or reach everybody with the same product. It's always good to kind of break these things up. Are we talking about right now about just certain professionals and researchers? And that's a different category than talking about engaging the public.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that there are two. What you're saying there is largely two different audiences of the general public versus the academic and professional public. But when I say public accessibility, I lump them both together because if it's accessible to the general public, then it's certainly going to be accessible to the academic and professional public. And I feel like it is important to keep in mind the difference between the two, but then that raises a question of how we promote or disseminate that information, I guess on platform purposes. I guess my point was mostly, in both cases, I think they should be relatively publicly accessible. It's just maybe you put the one that's maybe redacted or less technical on a more trafficked website that's going to be for general public, but you still have the more detailed report available for, say, a researcher in Germany who has some interest in this topic and wants to be able to access it, or a graduate or undergraduate student who's doing research and wants the more detailed report.
Well, and I'm arguing you could reach both audiences, but in slightly different ways with maybe two different products, depending what you're targeting, what you want to do. I think it's hard to get what one thing fits all in terms of who's out there that might be consuming this type of thing.
Oh yeah, I agree. I agree entirely that you have lots of different audiences. I guess I was just thinking in the sense of looking at the future of online archaeology, which I guess this might transition into one of the other questions because we're certainly not going to get to all of them. What we see the future of archaeology online to be. Hang on, I have the question here, but it's not pulling up. What we see the future of online archaeology, and I mean, from my own perspective, these audiences I see becoming somewhat one and the same in the sense that, Generation Z and the generations after them will have a very different online landscape to deal with for education in particular than, millennials, Gen X, boomers would have in terms of data accessibility. And I just know most of my students um, are online constantly, and they are pulling most of their information from the internet. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad, but that's the way that a lot of students these days are gathering information is via the internet, um, and they're not using physical sources or driving to um, campuses per se in the same levels they were maybe 20 years ago. And I just think that the next generation of archaeologists will probably be more prone to doing data mining than excavation. So I think it's critical that we consider the implications of making this data accessible to those future archaeologists in a way that's going to be useful for them than, say, making it hidden behind just hiding it in general or making it two different copies. Certainly, we want to make it promotable to the general public, like you're saying, but I just think there's going to be a larger number of the professional academic community that's going to be accessing it in the same way the general public would access it.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Who is speaking?
This is Nancy White. I put on the video, but I don't know if it's working. Anyway,
Yes.
I just wanted to contribute to this discussion because it's very interesting. I'm not in Ohio anymore. I work in the South, but I learned as a grad student working with collectors in Northern Ohio. And we do put a lot of our work online these days. One of the major reasons is we say, we know collectors are all looking this stuff up and they all know more than we do and they can tell us stuff. So when the work is out there and in it, I've said something like, here we have this artifact and we have no idea what it is. Or we have no clue whether this mound was once higher or whether people damaged it long ago or what it used to be. They all know more than we do and they want to tell us. They want to show us what they know. And it's fascinating to see. Yes, you get a lot of baloney in the responses, but now that even old-time collectors are on email, they can send pictures of their stuff and say, you thought there was none of this at that site, but see what I got there, you know. So it may really help your work. And then we never put it online without saying, look, don't damage this stuff. Write down where you got your materials. Help contribute to the heritage of all humanity, blah, 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 the usual. And sometimes it really works. So I just want to contribute that. And it's nice to be here for OAC meeting after such a long time. Thanks.
And Nancy, I think you do bring up some really good points there, and that there's also the issue of not only reaching people online who might not have easy access to these materials, but also physical distance. Archaeologists who might be working in other states or might be out of state, still researching Ohio. That's not uncommon. Needing access to these materials because you might not be able to drive to Columbus in a convenient manner to look at paper copies of reports. But you also raised another good point, Nancy, about engaging collector communities who might be reading these reports. And I think it ties into what Brian's saying about audience members. And in my limited experience with collectors on the project with Kevin, the Central Ohio Archaeological Digitization Survey, COADS, those collectors were eager to read technical reports, even if they didn't necessarily understand everything within them. And I think there's certainly an audience that's going to be willing to read those technical reports. And if we're going to write or publish things that are redacted or adjusted in some way for a general audience, we might be imparting our own biases on what we think the public should know or does know, or what their reading level is, and we may be filtering out people who otherwise would not have access to these data and be able to contribute new information about sites that they've collected, or information they may know, or a person they may know, and put us in contact with an informant of some sort. So you raise a couple of good points there, Nancy, and I'll shut up so then other people can chime in as well, so that it's not the Eric talking hour.
Hi, it's Ann Kramer. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Us retired folks are not very tech savvy, but we do the best we can. Lots of you know that I worked for the Wayne National Forest, and I dealt with looting pretty much my whole career. And I think everything that you've said is pretty much true. I mean, it's very useful, but there's really no one approach. I mean, you're not going to, you're right. it'll never stop because there's a really clandestine black market that you'll never stop. There are on the other end of the spectrum, there are concerned publics which would hear that message that we want to give of preservation. So I think the only hope we have is to continue the public outreach of, and try to instill a good ethic. And just kind of pick your battles where you can. If you're in a land management, type position like I was, and you can, try to have some control over managing a site and protecting, do it on a case by case. If you have data, site locational sensitive data, protect it where you can. That's all we can do.
You bring up a good perspective as someone who's a land manager herself and has experience in that. And formulating my own thoughts on that. Yeah, I guess it is a question of audiences and how we choose to engage with them, and the risks that we run of oversimplifying things or over-promoting other things. And I guess this kind of segues into the last thing I thought we should talk about, and that's what apps, platforms, social media, etc., we as archaeologists have experience with that we think have really engaged the public the best, which ones we think could be new avenues for expanding our outreach and engagement. Just to give you one example, I have, at least at Tri-C, obviously we have our own Twitch channel to stream live events like this one, or online lectures or discussions. I stream all of my office hours through Twitch, so that it's open to not just my students in one particular class, but any student can hop in, makes it easily accessible for them. Then it opens it up to people of the general public who might come in and have questions that are related, and we might bring in varying public perspectives that otherwise wouldn't have been engaging academically. I've also got I use the application Discord to engage with my students. That one's not really going to be engaging publicly with people so much. And then lastly, I've got a video game that I'm developing for my students to use as a sort of educational supplement, since I'm not going to be able to teach archaeology in person over the summer. So I figured it would be a way to engage students who can't physically see artifacts or physically get to a field school this summer, have sort of, it's not a perfect one-to-one replacement, but a way of sort of engaging them, I guess, in a more entertaining, not necessarily to say that archaeology is entertaining, but when you have to read a textbook and you can't physically go or see these things in a way that's somewhat more engaging than just reading about it and seeing a picture. Those are just some of the things that I've noticed tend to be attracting more of my students, and the younger population are, trying ways that aren't just giving a lecture-based presentation, or engaging with them in ways that are more than just, say, a blurb and a photo like we would do with Instagram, is maybe having personalized or more interactive one-on-one based online engagement, such as voice chat capabilities, live stream chat capabilities, ways that they can feel like they can identify with some sort of educational information, like in a game where they get to have control and they get to role play as an archaeologist to kind of walk through their own ideas about what it means to be an archaeologist and what archaeology is.
Oh, if you'll let me, Eric, I'm gonna, since you brought up a couple of other things and some examples, I want to share my screen here. For one, Eric mentioned our co-eds project, and so we are going out and talking to people who know more than we do, and documenting their collections, creating a GIS, and sharing the information that they generate if they let us. And so we share that. We create 3D models of the artifacts and post those. And if we have their permission, anyone can download these and print them off. And so that's another way for people to interact. And you've got virtual curation laboratory that Bernard Means is running, who does a ton more 3D scanning than we do. There are several good archaeology pages on Sketchfab that provide the public opportunity to interact with the material. And one of the things that we do with our models is that we have a general location of where it's at. So we report it to the township level, so people can look and they could search if they wanted to things that are in their county, in their township, whatever. That's not a great scan, so let's get off of that. And so there are other ways to different ways to engage. And then another thing to point out, we had this presentation that we gave. It was a public presentation. It was on WebEx. We had like 10 people, I think, maybe, rounding up, attend. But in a week, we've had 220 views. So people are out there and people are looking at this stuff. And I've seen the Cincinnati Museum Center, Bob Genheimer's been on all over the interwebs on videos. And so there are a lot of examples of sharing various levels of information that are out there that people can find if they're interested in finding stuff about the archaeological record and good examples for how we can hopefully engage more people as preservation partners.
All good points, Kevin. I had Sketchfab pulled up on my screen as well, just in case you didn't mention it as well. And on that note, I in my class in particular, I try to use Sketchfab scans for my students, like I said, who can't physically go into the lab to see these artifacts. I have assignments and lessons specifically to go onto Sketchfab and find 10 artifacts and trying to do some descriptive analysis based on the scan. And then I have them work on applications like MeshLab to then take measurements so that they at least can get some sort of semblance of a lab experience, even though it's not physically in a lab. And I think this also raises questions of the future of data capture and data mining, in that a lot of the stuff that we're doing for COADs right now, a lot of my involvement with that grant has literally been doing analysis and measurements of artifacts based on images with scales. So there's a lot that we can do with an image that has, so long as that image has some sort of context to it and it has a scale in the image, we can actually capture linear measurements. We can put in geometric, morphometric data to capture morphology. We can capture angles in ways that we otherwise wouldn't be able to capture with traditional means of calipers, like being able to measure the blade to stem ratio on projectile points can be done with much more precision and accuracy with a scan than you could with, say, calipers, because you can actually just drag your cursor down to the midpoint where the stem meets the blade, that you just really couldn't do the same way with physical means. Does anyone else have any comments, thoughts on the future of online archaeology?
So Kevin, I have and Eric, just a little insight here. Obviously, the academic folks have been teaching stuff online, mostly because you've been forced to, although I know some of you have been doing that beforehand, but museums have internships. And so yesterday I sat on a QZM webinar on using digital interns for more than an hour. I'm not sure what I learned, but so we're considering, we have lots of really high quality interns. We haven't said whether we've accepted them or not. They obviously have nowhere else to go. I mean, it's sort of a captive audience. So we're trying to make a decision in the next 3 or 4 days about, do we do it? And do we do it digitally? And if we do, how do we do it? And the thought is, are we just teaching online like the academicians are? Is that something that they really want? Because museum interns, they want, that physicality to sit there and touch things. So we're going to talk to the prospective interns and see how they feel about going forward with this. It's going to be a lot of work because we don't normally teach things online at this level. So the whole world is sort of turned upside down, and we're trying to figure out how to proceed here and embrace this technology, luckily, that we have. If this was 10 years ago, we wouldn't have this technology to even do these things. So maybe it's a good thing that we all start learning this stuff.
Yeah, you raise a good point there, Bob, and I think you are in essence, having to become an online teacher in that way. And I think it raises the question of what our priorities are going forward with what is critical, sorry, what is essential, right? According to the governor, and what is not. And, I think the things that at least I've been learning in the last, 3 or 4 months, ramping up to being fully online to having to teach the second half of the semester completely online, is that there's a lot of work that can still be done with metadata and organizing and maintaining databases that I think is, obviously, I'm taking an educator's perspective, but certainly people who are in um, museum situations like Bob can speak to this as well. There's plenty of organization that needs to happen in terms of making sure your database is cleaned up so that you don't have typos in it, making sure that you have the proper metadata in the proper places so that someone who wants to search your database isn't getting inaccurate information, isn't um, sent down the wrong paths. Obviously, I have my own perspective on that, but I think these are valuable lessons to be taught to the future generation of archaeologists because they're going to realize that a lot of a lot of the archaeology that they're going to be doing, a lot of their research is going to be dealing with managing databases to find relevant data to answer questions that they might have about the past, right? Because we're going to have so much data at our fingertips, it's a question of how do we organize it in a way that allows us to do systematic analysis. And I think Nancy, you also had put something in the chat as a comment. Let's see. Oh yeah, also collectors have GPS on their phones now. Be proud to send it to the professionals, not only a photo of artifact, but the coordinates. Right. You also raise a good point there too, Nancy, about people being proud of finding things, and if we can engage them in a way that allows them to immediately report what they found. And I don't want to step on Kevin because I know he's been working on something similar to that. I don't know if that's known yet. I don't know if you're allowed to talk about that yet, Kevin. But
What am I
uh,
doing?
the application that you were working on, or I don't know what the status of that ever ended up being. Um,
Oh, I haven't been trying to get funding to for a internet-based crowdsourcing documentation of artifacts and sites similar to what we're doing, where we're physically driving out to collectors and spending entire weekends in other people's basements. Um, uh, and I haven't been able to get funding for that. So if anybody's got any money that they want to give me, I will take it, and then I'll build a website that we can do that.
but yeah, I think something like that would be hugely beneficial for the future of archaeology. Some sort of application where collectors can then immediately engage with the professional and academic community instantaneously. Basically, having an application that you can you're in the field, you press a button, you take a photo of the artifact where it was found, or if you tell them, hey, give me a dime, a quarter, I don't care. If you have a photo scale, great. Throw it into the picture, and we now have, it's not all of the information we could possibly want, but if you throw in weight and thickness for a lot of, at least lithics, I'm speaking in general terms here. You could also include, I'm sure, pottery and other artifact types. If you get, weight, thickness, a photo, and a scale, and an A and a B side, you've captured a significant amount of data that you can then do some real analysis with, even if you can't get out to the collector to document the artifact yourself, or if you just don't have time because there's only 140 you said, Kevin, of us. Really crowdsources the collector aspect of it. Does anyone else have anything to add? Or we sounds like a whole lot of silence there. I know we went over. I wanted to go to 12:15, but there were some good comments from people, and I was glad to have some engagement with our members about what we think the future of online archaeology is. Obviously, we didn't need to have any conclusions or resolution or any problems that we were trying to solve with this panel discussion. I just thought it would be useful to have this discussion to get people thinking about new avenues of presentation of data, new ways of disseminating information, and how we will likely have to deal with online engagement in a much larger. Obviously, we've already been dealing with it in a much larger capacity, but probably this is not going to go away once we're given the green light to go walk around and shake people's hands and whatnot. It's probably still going to be with us for the foreseeable future. How to engage with people who can't go outside. or just can't get to physical locations. So thank you so much, everyone, for engaging in that panel discussion. I think that's where we're going to leave it for now.